Hello, today we're going to be talking about controllers in Rivals of Aether 2. So there's three main things that I value in controllers. It's their availability, their ergonomics, and their consistency. A controller can be great, but if you can't get the controller ever, that makes it to where that controller essentially doesn't exist. While the ergonomic factor makes it to where there's less resistance in tournament on the front of actually interacting with your controller. If your controller's hard to hold, then it makes it to where when you're playing in tournament, you're constantly straining yourself to play with the controller. And last but not least, consistency. If your controller has issues like snapback, unresponsive buttons, and triggers, then it makes it to where your controller's unreliable, and that impacts you the higher level you go. So let's start off with what I think the baseline for controller is, and these are your generic gamepad controllers. I really think that what sets them apart from each other is their form factors. The PlayStation controller has its sticks closer together, while I think on average the Xbox controller is larger than the Pro controller. So realistically, the reason I think that these are average is because they are easily available, though their cost is higher than you think it'd be. It's easy to modify and maintain them. They have access to extra buttons in the form of L3, R3, and an extra shoulder button compared to the Gamecube controller. And overall, there isn't an outstanding quality to them, but there aren't any bad qualities to them. That being said, let's go to underrated. I think the keyboard is underrated because it's fully customizable, it works with any computer, and you have a bunch of buttons to assign to different modifiers, strong attacks, and movement in general. Overall, I think the keyboard is a solid choice that most people overlook on their way to leverless controllers. From here, I think we need to talk about an overrated controller. I think the Gamecube controller is definitely overrated when it's a stock Gamecube controller. Most of the time when you're playing with the Gamecube controller, there's a period where you have to break in this controller to feel real nice. But there are other issues like potentiometer drift, the analog shoulder buttons, and the lack of a fourth shoulder button that really holds this controller back in the modern era. All that being said, if you're to modify the Gamecube controller, I consider this controller to be one of the better controllers. The amount of customized Gamecube controllers out there really speaks to the volume and the understanding of the community when it comes to controllers, that I think a custom Gamecube controller addresses almost all the issues that I have with the stock Gamecube controller. The only issue is that the Gamecube controller is missing the extra fourth shoulder button. But with notch integration, it makes it to where you can really customize recovery angles, shield drop angles, and any other specific angle that you need, while still retaining the usage of a control stick. I think Rivals' addition of a walk modifier also helps controllers because it means that you don't have to be as precise when wanting to do skills like pivot tilts. I also think that if you start modifying the hardware or the internals of a Gamecube controller, like the stick box, it makes them even better than the stock Gamecube controller. And that can also be said for something like the Pro GCC. A modified Switch controller has all the benefits of a modified Gamecube controller, but also with the added shoulder button. You can also add notches to the control stick, which puts it about on par with a modified Gamecube controller. And I think at that point it just comes down to personal preference and if you want that extra shoulder button. I would also like to add that I think modified Xbox and PlayStation controllers can be counted as underrated. Most of the time you would see these types of controllers in FPSs, but I think for Rivals, having these paddled controllers or just custom hardware in general puts these types of controllers way ahead of the competition. Now, of course, they're underrated because I think a lot of Rivals players come from Smash Bros, so most of their muscle memory is tied to the Gamecube controller. If your muscle memory isn't tied to the Gamecube controller, I think it's worth a shot learning this game with the generic controllers, but with custom paddles on the back. This allows you to keep your thumb on the right stick for aerials without fatiguing your thumb. I do think it's very important to distribute the workload of pressing buttons to all your fingers rather than just one. That being said, the next on our list is a few leverless controllers that I think are close to being really great, but fall short in certain aspects. I think the box and frame 1 are literally identical. The only issue is that the box has an outdated Rivals of Aether mode to it, while the frame 1 currently has a Rivals of Aether 2 software on it. I do think that it's almost impossible to get the frame 1, so I'll also put it in the better tier. The main issue with the frame 1 is that you literally just can't get it. There were reports of people waiting for 2.5 years for this thing. Of course, I kind of got lucky where I bought someone else's ticket and got mine in less than 6 months, but I understand not everybody's going to be that lucky to kind of just purchase one off of somebody or get one on the next restock. As I was saying before, the box doesn't really have the software for this unless you flash a third-party software to it, but the box is more easily available than most other leverless controllers to obtain. The Smash box. I want to love this controller because it has multiple different modifiers and programmable buttons, and you can change the angles, but the ergonomics with this particular controller end up making it to where you're either hyperextending your thumb to hit all the modifiers or having to curl your thumb in under your palm, depending on how big your hands are. Overall, I think it's a good controller, definitely usable, but its form factor makes it less optimal than something like a box or frame 1. Now, this last controller, I think you can tell that I think very highly of leverless controller. This represents other types of leverless controllers that are available on the market, like the Gram, Prism, and so on, that all have the form factor of a box or Hitbox, but these types of controllers allow you to fully customize your angles on your modifiers, as well as some of them are just cheaper than your traditional box or frame 1. So I think in terms of the 3 main things that I value, which was availability, ergonomics, and consistency, leverless is just a cut above in most categories. Of course, I do think that the cost of a box or leverless controller is one of the main factors on why not everyone uses one. Yes, I get that you would have to relearn a whole controller to get proficient with this thing, and using leverless controllers isn't exactly intuitive. But I think that's where custom leverless controllers have a very strong edge over the pre-manufactured one. Most pre-manufactured ones can be anywhere from $100 to $350, making them hard to justify for most casual players. In a tournament setting, I've heard of people paying $200 to $400 for Gamecube controllers, Pro GCC, modified PlayStation and Xbox controllers. So I know that there is a market for it, and it's not the most egregious pricing, but for most people, that's a huge amount of money for just one controller. That's where I think custom boxes really shine. I've heard people create these types of controllers for as little as $50, but the barrier to entry for this is really just being able to solder the controller together. While I do think that soldering isn't that hard of a skill to learn, I do think that you can just make a box literally out of a cardboard box if you know what connections to solder together. Leverless controllers are very consistent. You don't have to deal with things like snapback, any form of analog input, whether that's your control stick or your shoulder buttons. And I think time and time again, as we're seeing in most FGC games, as well as games like Super Smash Bros. Melee, that leverless controllers have lightning speed because of their digital inputs, to where some people think that they warrant a ban even. Well, I don't think that the disparity between a leverless controller and a modified controller is that much, with the addition of the walk mod and a bunch of Rivals of Aether 2's quality of life changes to controls. I do think at top level, some of the more difficult inputs that your brain would have to think of are made extremely trivial with leverless controllers. Now, I would like to go on record saying that if you have a controller that you have a lot of muscle memory with, then that's probably your best controller. Let's say that you come from an FPS background. Then using an Xbox or a PlayStation controller might be the wave for you, especially if you were playing something like Apex Legends or Fortnite, where you might casually just be playing with these controller options. But personally, I use a mix of all the controllers in this game, depending on what's available to me. In tournaments, however, I use leverless controllers. There are some other factors that you have to think of. For example, if you're playing Melee as well as Rivals of Aether 2, then your controller is being stressed by 2 games, and that makes it to where they wear out faster, so that might be something to take into consideration. But ultimately, while I might think that leverless are the best, your comfort with the controller makes the real difference between all of them. That, and I think that leverless controllers fall short in terms terms of a recovery like force burns, because they need a modifier per recovery angle to really be effective. And yes, while you can use a modifier or install modifiers on a custom controller, I do think that realistically most people aren't going to do that. So TLDR, I personally think that Leverless is the best controller for Rivals of Aether 2.